Series 3 recording. And today we are very fortunate to have the Mundani Tumadal Center team with Vicky Peters and also Matthew to talk about how we're embracing teaching and learning. So welcome all. My name is Verges Chan, and along with our team members, Karen Ward, for today's meeting. So first of all, I would like to do the acknowledgement of country. On behalf of those present, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we now meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia and hope that the path towards reconciliation continues to be shared and embraced. So again, welcome all to the meeting, and I would like Vicky Peters and also Matthew to introduce themselves to you.
Yeah, no worries. Vicky, are you happy if I just jump in first?
Sure. So yes, I'm Vicky Peters. I'm a Wurundjeri Yorta Yorta woman. I am also the manager of Indigenous Student Services with the Mundani Tumadal Centre. I have a wonderful team that I work with. It's our responsibility to ensure student success, and that includes ensuring that Swinburne is a culturally safe space for Indigenous students and people.
Great. Vicky, I'll jump in there as well. My name's Matthew Jakobi. I'm a Gunditjmara Tamara man living in Kulin country, and I've been living in Wathaurong country before that. I work at, Vicky and I both work at Mundani Tumadal Centre, which is the Aboriginal Centre, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Centre here for Swinburne. And Mundani Tumadal means embracing teaching and learning in the Woiwurrung language. And so, as Vicky talked about embracing students and their learning in their time here at Swinburne, my role at Swinburne is to help teachers embrace the responsibilities of caring for country, kin and ancestors as much as Vicky's caring for country, kin and ancestors. So our conversation today is reminding design students and design teachers of our responsibilities and our intentions of teaching and learning here at Swinburne University, which is built on Woiwurrung country. And as much as we would like to think that that event of colonisation and invasion took place way before our conversations we're having today, we would like to point out that this country is still owned and named by Aboriginal people. And this country is still in contestation about ownership. And how do we return and share land and share resources? So our conversation today is thinking about design, decolonising, and approaching respectful relationships with Aboriginal communities when we're designing in our communities. So, Verges, I would like to introduce if you could just do a little introduction about when you came to start thinking about Aboriginal design in your everyday work at teaching here at Swinburne. Is that possible?
Oh, yes, of course. Matt, actually, it dated back in 2018 in July. That was the first time that I actually get in touch with the Mundani Tumadal Center team and via a collaboration project to do with the first year of the Diploma of Interior Design student, actually looking at the design aspect of creating an Indigenous shared cultural space and also student lounge space at Hawthorne campus, and along with graphic design student rebranding their MTC logo. So that was our first time starting with the collaboration project. And in 2019, in August, I was invited to go on up to MET conference in Dalesford and share the Indigenous teaching and learning experience with other institution representatives across Victoria. Then last year, before the lockdown in September, I was fortunate enough to be invited and sit in the Indigenous panel for the Teaching and Research Symposium, and then share the teaching experience with the Swinburne staff members. And back in 2020, which is now, with the leading, with Kathleen Estoesta, and then we also got Karen Ward, Joshua Retiano, and also Amy Lindner as the team. And we would like to really continue what we have shared and learned in the past, and then bring it together and then implement into this new community project that we're working with City of Melbourne and also Salvation Army. And we call the project's name is a Second Chance Project. And then we actually looking into many sites, and then we recreating and also repurposing all the abandoned sites in the city. So I may let Karen Ward, our history teacher, and also the Design Global Trend teachers to explain a little bit of our project. So Karen.
Hi. Thanks, Verges. Last year, advanced diploma in interior design run by Kathleen, Estoesta, started on this project of Second Chance, which was about repurposing some Melbourne eyesores into emergency accommodation for rough sleepers in Melbourne. Which, of course, unfortunately, will also include a number of Aboriginal people as well. There's a lot of social stigma about being homeless and rough sleeping, and I do see great parallels. I basically believe that white Australia is a racist country. We were based on British racism, and I feel that there are certain parallels between the way the Kulin Nation was treated in Victoria in the early days of white occupation. Thank you. I'm losing words. And how people have become homeless and rough sleepers in the Melbourne CBD more recently. And so I think last year we opened up the eyes of the students about the plight and the stigma and the class bias and even the racism that is inherent in people's perceptions of rough sleepers. And the students actually started to realise that it was a very complex problem, both for those people and for the community. And I think also there are such strong connections with the way the Kulin Nation was treated in the early days of Victoria settlement by the English. And so I would really be hoping to push my scant knowledge, I have to say, of the problems for the Kulin Nation with my students as well as homelessness this year.
Okay, thanks, Karen. There was a lot of past, present and future dialogues happening in that design brief about the state of homelessness in 2020 and what that dialogue of how maybe a settler colonial, well, not maybe, of how Melbourne itself created homelessness for Kulin people. So, Vicky, I want to come now to you and talk about when did you come in? No, Verges, can we just go back to that? When did you come into this conversation with Verges as a colleague about design and thinking with Aboriginal ways of doing and being?
So I initially joined Swinburne as a project officer, and one of my projects was doing a scoping study for an Indigenous space at Swinburne because there wasn't one. So as part of that, I thought it would be wonderful to involve Swinburne students in that process. And so a way of incorporating, like I was thinking of ways to incorporate our ways of knowing and being into the design process, so students could go off and engage with Indigenous people and Indigenous histories and, have an idea about that. And it was also a way to guide the project.
Right. Yep.
Yes.
Okay, so what I want to do is here in this conversation here is sort of set up this notion of Aboriginal ways of doing and the dialogue of design ways of doing, what we might call the rituals of design and the rituals of Aboriginal ways of doing. But what I want to come to and say, why is it important to have an Aboriginal space within the university, and why was it important to have a respectful design that marked out that space? Vicky?
Yeah, well, you've all touched on it. Karen's touched on it. You've touched on it in terms of the impact of colonisation on Aboriginal people. It's only, 100 years since the first Aboriginal person could actually enter a university, and, you might have one, like the numbers have grown, but it's taken quite a long time to get to the numbers that we have had. There's also, like for instance, my own father, he was only able to be educated to the grade 6 as an Aboriginal man. So you have those impacts on a lot of families around education and access to education. There was a lot of many families didn't have great experiences in education. So it's really important to have a safe space for Aboriginal people within the education system, so they can come together, they can, engage in their culture and be with each other in an education setting.
Great. So what I want to just draw together again is Karen's conversation that Australia is, as a white settler colonial nation, is historically and contemporarily a racist nation. Was that the conversation, Karen? Yes. And so when we talk about racism, we're not actually just talking about evil, nasty things. We're actually talking about structural racism and how those structures privilege people while also marginalising others. All right, so we just sort of mapped out a little bit of the conversation here, and also about our intentions as people working in Swinburne, and what we're thinking about when we come together and have a conversation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people about places in Australian society. So Verges, do you want to flip to the next?
Sure.
Yep. Great. Okay. So this is looks like two design models. So who wants to chat first about the design or this process?
Well, Vicky, would you mind to start first?
Yeah, sure. So when I approached Verges' team about doing this, like we're on a collaboration project in terms of our space, as I said, I wanted to think of ways to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing and being into that process, and ensuring that students would also engage in our space in a respectful way. So I developed this Indigenous methodology, and it was actually after attending an Indigenous astronomy lecture, and it was like a light bulb moment in terms of that. So in terms of the methodology itself, I've called it a creation story, which links in quite nicely with Aboriginal people's creation stories. So, Aboriginal people have creation stories that help explain scientifically verifiable events across the land from our ancient past, and it relates the stories to our beliefs and who we are as people. So
can I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. So I know exactly what you're saying here, and this sometimes is really hard for people who have not understood or have been told these stories as being myths and legends as children, and they're just simple sort of analogies. But what these long storying, and for example, I know Noah Wheatbrick's stories about the day the bay got flooded, Naarm got flooded. And yes, you know, it's a story, so it's a story, it's a mythical story of when Bunjil said to two groups of people who were arguing over land, if you don't stop it, neither gets the land. Just starting to sound like an argument that I've had with my kids. But really what it is, it also talks about a process of how we solve the problems and disputes, and the importance of actually speaking through a process to solve problems and disputes. So as much as when we think about the myths and stories of Aboriginal people, what we're actually talking to, or what Vicky and I are talking to, is that this method of knowing and storing the world and storing new problems in old ways of understanding. Would that be a fair way of putting it, Vicky?
Yeah, it's that, and it's also you know, you've got to think that Aboriginal people have been around for tens of thousands of years, and they have witnessed some significant land changes and events that, you know, creation stories are actually a recording of that as well. So, like I said, it's also blends that scientific verifiable facts with ways of knowing and being. So Matt explaining, you know, it's done in a story-like way to also teach and keep Aboriginal people, like it imparts morals and law and everything into that process. So
yep, great. Okay, so at the same time as we've been chatting, I'm hoping the people who are listening to our conversation have been looking at this design cycle, and we won't necessarily sort of jump in it too much, Vicky, at the moment. But what you're telling me is that this storing and the cycling of storing continues, and it has always continued since creation.
yes,
And it will always continue after creation, because these are the first laws of country. Yes?
yes.
So Verges, can we flip over now? Because what I'm seeing, in my eye, I see a circle, and then I see a square, and I'm drawn to the square because I think this might be a ritual of, or the creation story for design problems, if we could say it like that. But this might be the ritual language of formal design, and you've got yours sitting to the right. Can you just tell us quickly about where and what this design process we're looking at, Verges?
Sure. I may leave the part to Vicky to explain the Indigenous language for the 4 stages for the creation story, but I can give you a little bit of how I can actually create this particular square bit on the right-hand side. So when I first actually received Vicky's creation story, to me, this is a new piece of language to me. When I'm looking at the gathering lineage, when I'm looking at the yarning circles, dreaming and the songline, straight away, because I'm actually in the design background, it drawn to my attention with those wording, especially to dreaming, that particular bit. So it did raise my interest and do a little bit of the digging and search on the internet. And to be honest with you, there's not too much about that particular context in there. And I went into Melbourne University for an Indigenous symposium before we actually started with the project to get myself a little bit of education, understanding what the Indigenous culture and history were. Then after I actually consulted with Vicky, and then that really opened up my Pandora box, and I was inspired by these particular 4 stages. And the one on the right-hand side is actually our formal unit of competency by the government rules. And I was reading along the way and looking at every single component. Then I start learning and then practicing what I know and what I have learned. And I realized that it's kind of similar to our design process, which is in our design language of research, going to our conceptual design, then we're going to design development documentation, and then with our final production, either it's an exhibition or presentation or some sort of finished products. But again, I also learned with my experience with the Indigenous history and culture that that actually happened in the same pace, which is the past, the present, and the future. And then when I start looking back in our design, we always think that, you know, when we're coming down to the production and the final will be the final, but actually it's not. We always could refine our design work, and almost we could actually start again with the same process. If anytime we get stuck, we go back to our research, then we get it together and we open everything and discuss. Then we do our own research and then get it together, and then we present it again. So this particular process that inspired me is kind of looking like parallel, and it's kind of like going to the same direction, but it's similar, but not exactly at this point. So I am still actually experiencing with that. So in the same time, I would like to bring this particular interest and then trying to show Swinburne staff and also with our students. So this is the general ideas how I come up with the slides on the right-hand side.
Great. All right. So Verges, I didn't mean, I was shortening you up there with some respect. So, so just to draw some attention back. So this design process that we've got in parallel with one another, this came out of the project to develop the actual symbol that we see on the bottom right-hand side, the Mundani Tumidal symbol. Is this right? This is right, Vicky and Verges?
Yes, the right-hand bottom one is a logo that last year with actually 2 years ago with the graphic design student, and they rebrand the Mundani Tumidal Center with Vicky.
Great. So this is similar. This design process, this internal Swinburne design project that we've got going with students. If I could present this challenge to us, we've got the squared rituals of professional practice and language in design, which is what you just explained, and that's the right-hand big square. And then we've got the circles storing of country and creation of country and a way of knowing, being and doing, caring for country on the left. So what we're really asking our students and staff is to know the professional language of our work, say design, and we're inviting students to also now think about the older language of country, that text of country, the story of country, but also the ways of knowing country. And so what I see is if we were to think of us being that yellow, or think of us, our students being the yellow space in between the square design process and the circle design process, we're asking students to think about what useful tools are in the creation story cycle design, and what useful tools are in the square rituals of design. And as you said, you weren't comfortable, Verges, pushing them together, as there's bits still that don't quite fit together, but there's a sense of trying to talk both country and talk design. And I'm wondering now if this is a good time to talk to the project. Is this okay if we move now to the next slide, Verges?
Yes.
So can I just get quick and do a little summary of where we are again? We've introduced a long story of country. And we're now thinking about how does this big, long story of country sit with and within the structures of the formal structures of settler colonialism, which is Melbourne City. So we've got Naarm, which is old country. The way we know country is Naarm, sitting, and we've got Melbourne sitting up on top of it. So I'm just going to turn off my prompts that are asking me to join another meeting. And because it's not a very interesting meeting. So now is that a reasonable way of setting up the design problem and project, Karen, or someone?
Okay, I'll just jump in here for the moment. That I think one of the elephant in the room, for want of a worse cliche, is that for the majority of non-Aboriginal Australians, that they do not have a connection to country. They do not have that deep, innate understanding of the land, and which is part of their soul, their religion. We whiteys are much more about what we can actually dig out of the land and build on the land. There is not a connection with the land. And so there is a fundamental problem, I think, in trying to explain that difference. And, you know, the job warehouse, it was built in 1884, I think. Yes, that's right. It was just before the gold rush. Oh, no, sorry, 1834. It was a Georgian building. King George was ruling the world, basically. And it was started off as, you know, part of it was the first two buildings were butchers and a slaughterhouse. The four shops had four residents behind them, where people lived and ran their businesses. This was completely anathema to the Kulin Nation. They, you know, there was a certain amount of interaction between the two groups during those times. Once the gold rush hit, like, population just boomed, and the Kulin Nation suffered even greater dispossession.
Cool. Can I jump in there? So Karen, there's a couple of conversations here, because whenever we want to look back at our history in Australia, and what we would say is white Australia has a black history, yeah, we say that the event and the issue or our grievances is back there, and it's with black and white Australia. Now, that's the general mantra and conversation. Now, what I want to put, and I'm going to be point out Verges as a non-white settler or migrant. What would you call yourself? Are you a settler or a migrant, Verges?
I would, well, I actually born in Hong Kong, and then I came here roughly around 25, 28 years ago. I will consider myself as a migrant.
Yeah, cool. All right. So what we've got is an emergence of some narratives and some structures, what I would call race narratives, appearing in the structure. So we've got this notion that and I'm thinking about the Hoddle grid, and for the layout of the Hoddle grid is an imperial architecture that's been played out over Aboriginal land. And it runs parallel to the river, in fact, which is an unusual design in itself, but the Hoddle architecture. But if you look at the Hoddle architecture of the city blocks, most of it was Chinatown. So if we go back to, what was it, 1834, so the gold rush hasn't hit. So we are seeing, this is actually the bit of the dodgy end of the street, even though Parliament is sitting up on its hill looking down. In emerging, this end of the street has always been a little bit sort of risky. And there was, and so when Chinatown started to appear, I think after the gold rush, Well, we actually put a law in to stop Chinese coming in 1855 because the settler colonial, or the white architecture, as Karen described, was so worried that Melbourne was going to become a Chinese sort of city. So the expansion and collapse of Indigenous Kulin country, we've also got an expansion and collapse of Chinese migrants. And then we've also got an expansion and collapse of white settlers, yeah? So just in that little history there, we've got a whole different groups of people who have got colonial power, bits of colonial power, and no colonial power, yeah? So it was a butcher's shop and had a residence out the back. Yep, and so this would have been, if we were to describe this building's sort of busyness, who would have been using the butcher shop, Karen?
Oh, well, he would have sold, he would have slaughtered animals out the back and sold the meat fresh, but he also would have salted a lot of it. There was no refrigeration, so there was, you know, how do you actually preserve meat would have been his main concern. So it would have been for the local Melbourne population, the white population. There was a lot of gifting of food to the Aboriginals that the whites befriended. You know, Melbourne was growing. It needed services like a butcher shop, and I think there was I forgot what the other ones were at that particular time when it was first built, but you know, it was the beginning of, you know, sort of the
Batman's Village.
Yeah, but the beginning of sort of middle class commercial enterprise.
Yep. I live in Footscray, and so what I know is there was a blue lake in between North Melbourne and Footscray, and it was sort of a little bit dodgy, where the homeless and the rough sleepers were moving in between Footscray and the city to work in the abattoirs and the meatworks all along the rivers. What was it after a butcher shop?
I've actually got a list of everything that actually. Well, there's the bookshop that is still there. That's been there for my life.
Butchers. Sorry, and so how come the Salvation Army own this place?
No, they don't.
Oh, they don't own it?
No.
I'm sorry, I may just jump in a little bit,
yeah,
Matt.
Great.
The job warehouse is actually one of the sites that we consult City of Melbourne, and looking into the abandoned sites. If you're actually looking at the slides on the left-hand side, shop 56 to 58 has been abandoned for a long time. And because what we are searching is opportunity of repurposing any of the city eyesore building that we consider to repurpose the buildings to make it useful for community. That's why we're doing a feasibility study, and then we will ask the interior design students to actually repurposing the space, and then the building design student to looking at the construction side, graphic design students to do a wayfinding system and solution, and with the event people to promote our team. So that is the reason why we've got that.
Sorry, I got it. Okay, cool. Sorry, Vic, do you want to jump in here and have a? Do you know much? Because what I'm thinking is, in that area has always been Aboriginal gathering place. Is it Tandarra?
Yes.
Yes, and Birangma. So we're seeing a renaming. Is it a renaming when we start to call those places by their original names? That's a question I want to maybe put. Are we naming or renaming, or are we claiming or reclaiming these spaces? Yeah. So, because I know of the North of Fitzroy communities, because that's one of the closest suburbs to the top end of town. So, and then we think about that long history of Fitzroy political movements. Vicky, and the isn't the medical centre is in Fitzroy, and the legal service is in Fitzroy. And so the issues of being homeless, dispossessed, and moving, but then also moving back into the imperial settler architecture. But what I want to ask is it's abandoned building and it's an eyesore. And these are really interesting words about eyesores, yeah, because, for example, in Mooroopna, when the Aboriginal mission at Mooroopna, it's not a mission, it's a reserve, yeah, Vicky, when the Queen went past in 1950s, they put up Hessian sacks so the Queen couldn't see into the conditions of the Aboriginal communities, where, because Mooroopna was just far enough out of Shepparton that you couldn't get into town, you know. So what I'm thinking about is, what is an eyesore? How do we fix eyesores? But I've got another question too, and it's repurposing a building for a civic purpose where the community could use. So do we just go and make it pretty by putting Aboriginal design on it? Or do we need to repurpose the design so it upsets the rest of the colonial architecture? Sorry, I'm just jumping in. Karen?
Can I butt in here?
Yep.
Being the last Georgian commercial building still standing in Melbourne, it has a really strong heritage overlay, and like you've got Buckley's hope of doing much to the external, the walls.
I love it that you use the term Buckley, by the way. William Buckley, the convict that went and lived with the Wathaurong and then, you know,
Yes.
helped George Augustus Robinson sort out the land claims of the settlers. But anyway, we'll have Buckley's hope. So I guess what the challenge, what we just said,
Matt, in that design process, like gathering knowledge, it's really important that, you know, design students understand the people that they're actually doing these for. So, you know, you've given a great, you know, it's a very brief story about Melbourne and Aboriginal people and homelessness and dispossession. So for students to actually fully understand the people that they are designing the buildings for, I think is really important. So that's that gathering knowledge part of that design process, isn't it?
So what's some skills, Verges, that you needed to have when you went out and gathered knowledge about Aboriginal people? I'm not thinking about the knowledge that you gained. What was your behaviours, your attitudes, your protocols of engaging and inquiring about these questions?
Well, to be honest with you, Matt, I still actually searching a way to really understand and engaging myself with the Indigenous culture and history. So I feel like that when I was talking to Vicky, and especially when I mentioned that before receiving the particular, the 4 cycles in there, I think the main thing for me as a teacher is to really to do the research and trying to understand and talk and discuss with the team members and students about what is actually the Indigenous culture, and really looking and consult with Vicky to see, all right, so what really gathering knowledge means to me, and how can I actually bring this particular idea and then share with my design student. That's why we come up with this particular floor plan that if you're looking in the middle, and this is one of the ways that I communicate with my artwork and my graphic work, which is a floor plan that if you're looking in the middle panel, that it kind of align with Vicky's ideas. So Vicky, I'm possibly going to pass the ball back to you because to me and for design student, we are more visualized person. So, and people that we can actually looking and understand better than just a language or just in word. As we all know that design people, we don't read. We actually look at graphics more strongly than reading all the text and word. That's why I recreated this particular floor plan in this particular pattern. So Vicky, would you be the honest to explain what is the yarning circles? Because we understand what is knowledge gathering is actually quite straightforward, that we gather together, do our research. And nowadays, when we do research, we're not based on just textbooks. You know, we gather together, do the shortcut, quickly check in the internet, download the news. But I feel like the yarning circles comes in the second stage, which is really gather together and looking a little bit more deeper. So Vicky, would you mind to explain your version of yarning circles to us?
Well, yeah, so yarning circles, I suppose, is another practice that's been around for thousands of years. It's a way that Aboriginal people have passed down old histories, and they do song and dance. But I mean, yarning for us is talking. It's just talking through things. It's learning. It's understanding each other. So
is there a time limit
in this process is quite important, because, you know, if you look at the circular design process or the creation stories, you know, you'll jump from each stage and come back. So you'll gather knowledge, you'll yarn about it with your friends, your people that you know, to try and understand what you're learning. You might start dreaming about your design concepts, but you'll come back to yarning about it and seeing, you know, is this right? Is this okay? So it's part of that really. And traditionally you would have elders sitting in the middle, and, you know, groups, the community around talking, and the elders talking about particular things. So.
Hey, Vicky, I was jumping in there because I wanted to hurry up your detailed conversation about yarning, because we don't have the time in our designing plan to actually listen effectively to Aboriginal people. I'm joking. But what I wanted to point out is because usually consultation appears in people's documentation. Are we going to consult with the elders? And they never talk about A, who were the elders, who decided they were elders, B, how did they localise and actually make those connections with elders, and is it really just elders that they should be talking to, or they should be talking to maybe Aboriginal people who are in design, you know, and actually have those languages. And then they only go and talk once, and they might hear silence as an agreement. Or they might hear, I guess what I'm trying to point out is yarning about country takes a long time. And so yarning and listening effectively, and like me trying to butt in, being the typical bloke that I am, while Vicky and over talking her while she's trying to talk about that long yarning process, doesn't help. So sometimes in the design process, or in the yarning and the gathering knowledge, we have to be paying particular attention to clues and cues, silences, and knowing when and how to have conversations with place. So, you know, we see, for example, Vicky, in design, I'm thinking about those T-shirts with the T-shirts or the tea towels with dots on them, or the Vic Market didgeridoos that have got the dotted things on, and you know that when you look at them, Vicky, that they don't tell the story, that the outsider thinks that they're telling the story, you know. So we need to be really careful when we're doing that yarning and that reflection cycle, because we need to localise it, and we need to give it good, decent time and place. Yeah, because that's been the problem in the past. And I'm thinking about the Batman Treaty, yeah, where it was a rushed, forced treaty. It didn't have clear intentions about whether it was rent or whether it was a purchase, whether Batman even had the right to make the treaty, and whether all of that other stuff. So sometimes, and I know projects get frustrated because of the detailed level of consultation needed. But when we do the design, we're actually needing to pay attention to that. So Verges, for example, there are times when he had to be told off in his relationship with Vicky, yeah, with respect. I'm not saying that that actually happened, but I'm thinking that there would be times when we've gone, no, Verges, that's you're not listening. You have to listen again, or not. Or no, students, you have to listen. You're not listening, and we need to be paying attention to that when we're in these relationships. Yeah. The other one I want to put to Verges.
Can I just add? I think it's particularly important that in this instance, in this project, because of the people that you're designing this space for. So you do have to be really listening to the needs of those people. So, yeah.
So,
second, that the job warehouse space is actually a commercial design project. So we're designing, repurposing the building as a cafe, op shop, and a rentable space upstairs for the general public in order to make money to service one of the other sites that we're repurposing for rough sleepers. So it is not directly connected, even though we've been talking to you about Aboriginal culture and listening to Aboriginal voices. The actual end users of this building are not necessarily going to be focused on Aboriginal people.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So this leads sort of now to my conversation about whose responsibility it is to know Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander standpoints. So Verges, with respect, you were given this design plan with Vicky some years ago to come up with a new logo for Mindani Tumidal. And there's a point where Vicky needed to educate you and localise and get you thinking about certain things. And then there's a point when we've got to say to Verges, now off you go. And you need to go off and find other things. So I want to just draw the attention about when we, so yes, it may not be an Indigenous project, but it is built on Indigenous land. So we as designers in contemporary, or we as people in contemporary Naarm, Melbourne, should be thinking always with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander standpoints, because we are in Aboriginal country. It may not feel like it now in 2020, but give us another 30, 300,000 years, whatever number of years before the Anthropocene wipes us out. It will return to Aboriginal country. And we have seen this returning of Naarm. We're starting to see the architecture now reflect the story, say the William Barrack building. We're starting to see the memorial of Tomawait's execution in Franklin Street. So we're now asking designers, Australian designers, Melbourne designers, designers of Naarm to know Aboriginal culture, but not always burden Aboriginal people in their always coming to know, just with respect. So there's a bit of dialoguing with Aboriginal people, but there needs to be another dialogue with non-Aboriginal people about how they do the returning and how they do the negotiation and what extra work they need to do. So Karen, for example, I know you're a historian just by nature, I suspect. So there's things that you're thinking within the rituals of your language of being a history person and thinking, hang on, there's a whisper in my heart that tells me that I only know this much amount of Melbourne's history when there's this much. And so there needs to be a part of us as people living in Naarm to want to know Naarm, to want to know country. And then we've got to think about what is our own responsibilities in learning country because you remember Aboriginal people only make up 3% of the population, and if we had 97% of the population coming to us wanting to know country, we could never care for country in our own time. So that would be my issue, is my conversation is, what do you do with this knowledge once you've gone off, after you've done the design as students, as teachers? What is the intention? So I come now to what we call Wominjeka, which in the language of the Woiwurrung is a welcome to the land of Nam. What are your intentions?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Actually, there's more than like 3 or 4 questions in there. I'm trying to really shorten it. I think I'm going to bring it back, everybody in here, to really looking at the purpose of the meeting. So it's not just an history knowledge. What we're trying to do in here is, if you're looking at the graphics that I produce in here, I'm actually introducing a way of communication. I'm trying to reconnect and to bring different group and different course students together to really listen and gathering the knowledge. To moving from gathering knowledge to a yarning circle, I may give everybody a little bit of the history. Before I actually, that is your first question, Matt, asked, you know, did I actually consult Vicky before I actually do that? Actually, before I consult Vicky, I went to Melbourne University for the symposium. That was the first time that I was putting in to a so-called meeting with hundreds and thousands of people across Australia, just to learn the Indigenous culture and listen to speakers talking about every single aspect of the section. And I was put inside one of the room. When I walked into one of the room, to be honest, I thought, oh my God, it's going to be a long, because I could not focus. If anyone talked more than 10 minutes, I was gone. And same as the other design students. But what actually kept me alive and awake in the particular hour meeting is, when I first walk into the room, there's nothing but the setup like what we've seen in the middle. I didn't know what the yarning circle is, but what happened is, when I actually see there is in the middle with 4 chairs, and then the sitting around, and then we just pick up randomly and sit in there with no name tag, nothing. And then when there's a particular topics being given in that room, and then everybody was sitting together, I was kind of fitting in that particular configurations quite comfortably, because I don't feel like that I have to be sitting like a normal lecture room that someone in the front keep talking or looking on a blank screen or just looking on a PowerPoint, like what we're doing now, unfortunately, but together around with that particular synergy. Yeah. And I was much more involved, and I feel like I'm part of it. And because of that, I don't feel like I put on the stand. Then I actually can hear properly with the conversation what they want to talk. And that was the first yarning circle experience that I had. And then I was trying to introduce this one back on campus this year. However, because of the COVID-19, we could not be physically gathered together with 4 group of the students. If you're looking in this one in here, Matt, my purpose of having this particular configuration is following, instead of the ATC 101 actual meeting face-to-face, I created this virtual meeting hall space with the floor span, with all the team members and the students involved in this particular project has set all around here. And what we're trying to offer the student is an experience of the same format that we can actually gather together in a virtual space, safe space, but still having this particular context and conversations going to engage them, to learn all this particular project and what we want to share with Swinburne staff and students. That's right, why Verges. I have that one.
Great. I'm going to cut you down there, Verges. I just know we could continue talking there. I just want to keep on following our thread about our intentions. After having our conversation about place and returning Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing to design and place. So, Karen, are you able to talk perhaps maybe what your intentions are in... yeah, okay. So.
As a teacher, because I largely teach sort of history, is to get students to think differently, to open their minds to things that they might not have been aware of, and to privately confront their own biases, and to think a bit deeper. That is about my main aim as a teacher. And so, you know, I think that the history of Melbourne is extremely interesting and insightful, and that Melbourne students should know more about where they live.
Thank you. Vicky, would you like to maybe think about, after going through this process, what are your intentions?
My intentions?
Yeah.
I suppose I'm much like Karen in terms of getting students to think a bit more deeply about what they're doing. So, you know, I could explain, you know, as I said before, the methodology came out after an Indigenous astronomy lecture, for instance. So, you know, as Aboriginal people, what we see in the sky is much grander than just stars, planets and constellations. You know, it tells us what we already know about the world and, you know, how it operates. It explains time, life, and our place in the universe. So, you know, trying to think a bit more deeply about what you're doing and that design process. So that gathering knowledge, yarning circles, dreaming, for instance, you know, for us, dreaming is the heart of our belief. You know, it's how the creator spirits arose and created, you know, everything that we see on the planet today, you know, plants, life, people. It connects Aboriginal people to a particular land space. So, and then you've got the song line, which is, you know, the description of the creator, or the, you know, the path that the creator spirit took. So getting people to think a little bit outside the square in terms of what they're doing and understanding their place, you know, understanding their connection to this place that they're on now.
Okay, I might just finish with my intentions and then we might round it up. This might be a little bit of a soapbox declaration, but I might be also a bit of a summary of perhaps where we are as Swinburne colleagues, but also as Swinburne staff, and our responsibility in working in a university that's positioned on Aboriginal land. So what my intentions are is to return Indigenous land and Indigenous life. So this returning can be a physical returning of land, and we're seeing this, but it could be returning of marking and spacing and organisation. It could also be a returning of ways of knowing, doing and thinking. So in this returning, it's going to be tense, it's messy, because as much as colonisation was messy, violent to Aboriginal territories, the returning of Aboriginal territories will also be messy. So we know that this messiness exists because we still do not have a treaty between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the Commonwealth after 230 years of ongoing occupation that is reasserted each day. But what we have also seen is a growing number of people who are thinking, when I say a growing number of people, a growing number of settlers and migrants who are thinking about our messy, dark, sometimes violent past, but also know that there was this other beautiful, longer knowing of country. And we're moving closer and closer into a circle like Verges' symbol here in the middle, where we're actually coming to a deeper listening to country. Now, this deeper listening can be listening to people like Vicky and I. It can be a deeper listening of engaging in negotiation processes or project negotiations with Aboriginal people. But I think it's also a deeper listening to ourselves as citizens in this country, and a deeper listening to what is it that causes us grief as a nation. and for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that grief is the non-recognition of our ongoing sovereignty and the violence that exists when that sovereignty was taken off us. But I think once we come to that question, we'll also come to a much more peaceful, integrated way of being people on Naarm. So what I'm hearing is we need to be reflective. We need to be deep listening. We need to find ways to talk across with other groups of people. And we need to know what our intentions are. Whether it's to just put something pretty in a colonial background or keep a Georgian building in its colonial background, or can we find ways to converge, disrupt, or co-tell stories that will speak of our past but also speak of futures? So if there's nothing anyone else wants to add to the conversation?
I think, Matt, if we were to keep going and discuss, it's going to go on over for another 3 or 4 hours. So and then as I said that, you know, the time is very important for everybody. Yeah. And there's a lot of information and discussion for our students and our staff members to digest. So I really think that it will be great if we can have another series of meeting in the future. So I do look forward so we can discuss a little bit more. But so far, and I'm just very glad that to have this an hour conversation with all of you.
Okay, so I might stop the recording now. So again, thank you everyone for their contribution.
Thank you.
And thank you for everybody's coming.
All right, so I'm stopping now, but